Um, Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we're staring directly into the abyss of what is arguably the most volatile geopolitical standoff on the planet right now.
Yeah, it really is.
We're talking about the Middle East, specifically the tension between Iran, Israel, and the West. But, and I want you to stick with me here, we are not just going to rehash the news today.
Right, because there's enough of that already.
Exactly. We are looking at a roadmap out of this mess that is, frankly, unlike anything I have ever seen proposed in a standard think tank paper or a military briefing.
It's certainly a departure from the usual menu of options. I mean, usually when we talk about this specific conflict, the options are incredibly bleak.
Yeah, they really are.
It's either a full-scale regional war,
Yeah.
which would be catastrophic for the global economy and obviously human life, or it's a diplomatic deal that effectively just kicks the can down the road while the centrifuges keep spinning.
Exactly. The binary choices usually bomb the facilities or send pallets of cash and just sort of hope they behave.
Right, the classic carrot or stick.
Yeah. But the source material we are working with today proposes a third way. And it's a way that involves a very specific type of spiritual reckoning, the mobilization of millions of people who aren't even inside the country, and a geopolitical chess game that pulls in everyone from the White House to the Chinese Communist Party.
It's a fascinating synthesis of hard power and soft power. So we are primarily analyzing a manifesto-style blog post today. It's titled The Path to Peace, Confronting Iran's Regime Through Spiritual Clarity and Diaspora Action.
Catchy title.
Yeah, and it was written by an author who goes by Brockface,
Yes.
also known as Paramendra. And for a bit of context, he identifies himself as Barack Obama's first full-time volunteer in New York City back in the day.
Which is already an interesting hook, right? Someone with that grassroots political organizing background tackling high-stakes Middle East strategy.
It brings a totally different flavor to the analysis.
It does, but we aren't just looking at that text in isolation. To really understand the urgency behind this proposal for you listening, we have to layer in the context from a whole stack of other reports we have here.
Right, the broader picture.
We've got data on China's new hypersonic missiles. We have reports on the Iron Alliance forming between Israel and India. And we have the latest signals coming out of the U.S. regarding military frustration.
We really have to set the stage because this proposal doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's being presented at a moment of extreme tension. You have this war versus peace dynamic pushed to its absolute limit.
Yeah, the tension is palpable.
The premise here is that the old tools are broken, and if we don't find a new tool, we are quite literally heading for a cliff.
So here is the mission for this deep dive. We are going to unpack this plan step by step. We need to understand why the author thinks the current military options are doomed to fail, and we will get into the actual physics of why that is.
The physics part is wild.
It really is. We also need to understand why he believes the solution is actually theological rather than just political, and we need to figure out how on earth a diaspora strategy is supposed to topple a regime that has survived for decades of sanctions and internal dissent.
And we really need to scrutinize the grand bargain he proposes. He suggests a way to satisfy Russia, China, and the U.S. all simultaneously.
Which seems impossible.
It's an incredibly complex needle to thread.
Complex is an understatement.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's unpack this. Let's start with the why now part of the argument. The source opens with a philosophical but very practical point. War is messy.
Inherently chaotic is the phrase he uses.
Right, inherently chaotic. Now, we hear this a lot like war is hell, but the source seems to be making a very specific strategic point here.
He is. He argues that even just wars fought for the absolutely right reasons bring death, destruction, and unintended consequences.
It feels like he's pleading with the reader to understand that you cannot just surgical strike your way out of this problem without things getting incredibly ugly.
It's a crucial preamble. He is establishing that war must be the weapon of last resort. And this isn't just a pacifist plea. He acknowledges that sometimes you have to fight. But he points out a glaring disparity in military capacity that I think a lot of people completely overlook.
Yeah, this part actually made me pause and reread, because we tend to think of the U.S. and Israel as these omnipotent military powers. But the source forces us to look at the math.
Let's break down that math because it's startling.
Please do, because the numbers don't seem to add up at all. He compares the military doctrine of the United States, the literal superpower, to what Israel is currently doing.
So standard U.S. military doctrine historically has been sized to fight maybe 2.5 major conflicts simultaneously.
2.5.
Yes.
Yeah.
That is the benchmark for the most powerful military in human history. The Pentagon plans its budget, its logistics, and its manpower around the idea that if we have to fight in Europe and Asia at the exact same time, we can just barely manage it.
So 2.5 wars is the absolute ceiling for the superpower.
Correct. Now, the author points out that Israel, a nation, a fraction of the size, literally roughly the size of New Jersey, is currently fighting what he identifies as an 8-front war.
8 fronts. I mean, look, we see the headlines about Gaza and we see the northern border with Lebanon, but 8, that sounds like hyperbole.
It sounds like it, but let's map it out because it's not. Front 1 is Gaza. That's intense urban warfare against Hamas.
Right.
Front 2 is the northern border. That's Hezbollah in Lebanon, which has a massive, highly sophisticated missile arsenal.
Okay, that's 2.
Front 3 is the West Bank. Constant internal counterterrorism operations. Front 4 is Syria, where Iranian militias are trying to entrench themselves right now. Front 5 is Iraq. Shia militias launching drones from there. Front 6 is Yemen. The Houthis firing ballistic missiles all the way across the Red Sea.
And disrupting global shipping while they're at it.
Exactly. Front 7 is Iran itself, the head of the octopus, the primary source of the funding and strategy for all the others.
And the 8th?
Front 8 is the international arena, the diplomatic lawfare happening at the UN and the International Criminal Court.
When you list it out like that, it's just staggering.
It is. And the source expresses genuine bafflement at this. He literally says how they achieved this remains baffling, a testament to their ingenuity. But the strategic implication of this is terrifying.
Because if the U.S. says we can't handle 3, and Israel is currently juggling 8, the system is redlining.
Yes, it's physically and economically unsustainable over the long term.
So the rubber band is stretched to the absolute breaking point. The logical next question for anyone looking at this is, why doesn't the U.S. just step in? We have the aircraft carriers, we have the firepower. Why not just park a carrier group in the Persian Gulf and tell Iran to knock it off?
Well, a few years ago, that would have been the exact answer. But this is where the source introduces a complete game changer. And I want to be really specific here because this isn't just about big missiles. We are talking about China's new capabilities.
Yeah.
Specifically, Mach 3.3 missiles.
Okay, yeah, I'm looking at this report in our stack right now. It says China's new Mach 3.3 missiles in Iraq. America's carriers are in serious danger. Now, I'll play devil's advocate here for a second. The U.S. Navy deals with fast things all the time. We have the Phalanx system. We have the Aegis combat system. Why is Mach 3.3 the sudden tipping point? Is it just the raw speed?
It's not just the speed. It's the physics of that speed. When a missile hits Mach 3.3 in the lower atmosphere, the friction is so incredibly intense that it creates a plasma sheath around the fuselage.
A plasma sheath.
Yes, superheated ionized gas. And that plasma actually absorbs radio waves. It acts exactly like a cloak, so the missile becomes intermittent or even totally invisible to standard radar.
Wait, so you literally can't shoot what you can't lock onto?
You can't. The carrier group is effectively blind until the impact is mere seconds away.
That is terrifying.
And unlike an old-school ballistic missile that follows a totally predictable arc, like a fly ball in baseball where you can calculate exactly where it's going to land, these modern hypersonic cruise missiles can maneuver. They can change direction in mid-flight.
So even if you miraculously spot it through the plasma cloak, by the time your interceptor gets to those coordinates, the target has completely moved.
Exactly. The source argues that this specific capability checkmates the traditional park, a carrier-off-the-coast intimidation tactic. It turns a multi-billion-dollar strategic asset into a sitting duck.
That changes the entire geopolitical calculus. I mean, if you risk losing a carrier and the 5,000 sailors on board, that is a political catastrophe that no president could possibly survive.
Which perfectly explains the other source we have in our sack today, the one titled, Trump Increasingly Frustrated on Iran Military Options. If you connect the dots, you have a president who likes to project ultimate strength.
Right.
But his generals are likely walking into the Oval Office and saying, sir, we cannot guarantee the safety of the fleet if we get into a shooting war anywhere near the Iranian coast. That is a political and military nightmare scenario.
So you have a massive deadlock. Israel is fighting 8 wars and obviously can't go on forever. The U.S. is checkmated by Chinese missile tech, or at least the risk is way too high to test it in real life. And meanwhile, Iran's foreign minister, Abbas Araki, is out there giving interviews saying we are fully prepared for both options, war and peace.
He sounds very confident, doesn't he?
He really does.
And why shouldn't he be? He knows the U.S. is hesitant right now. He knows Israel is incredibly busy. This deadlock creates a massive vacuum. And it is straight into this vacuum that our source Brockface drops his proposal.
Yeah, he basically says you are trying to solve this with kinetic weapons in a room where kinetic weapons have been neutralized. You need a completely different weapon.
And that weapon is ideology, or rather, the systematic dismantling of an ideology. Which brings us to section 2 of our discussion, the ideological diagnosis.
This is where the deep dive gets pretty heavy, because the source doesn't pull any punches at all. He reframes the conflict entirely. He says this isn't about borders, it's not about territory, it is a, quote, classic struggle between good and evil.
Now, I know that sounds like standard political rhetoric. We hear good versus evil all the time in speeches. But he backs it up with a very specific claim about Iran's core intent.
And just to be clear to you listening, if there's any politically charged content here from the left or the right, we are not taking sides. We are impartially breaking down the arguments presented in these specific source texts.
Absolutely. We're looking at the mechanics of his argument. He points out that the Iranian regime is totally unique among nations currently sitting in the UN. He argues that no other country has a publicly declared official policy of the complete eradication of another sovereign nation.
Right. He says if it were just about land, you could negotiate a border. If it were about the Palestinians, you could sit down and find a two-state solution. But he argues the explicitly stated goal is the actual erasure of Israel from the map.
And this is exactly where he addresses the nuclear apartheid argument. You often hear critics say, why is it okay for the U.S. or Israel to have nuclear weapons, but it's somehow racist to say Iran can't have them?
Yeah, the double standard argument.
Right. But the source argues it's not racism, it's not apartheid, it's a direct response to intent. If a nation's stated official goal is genocide, you simply don't give them the match to light the fire.
That distinction is so crucial to understanding his entire strategy. But then he goes even deeper. He says fighting the nukes or fighting the proxy militias or bombing the missile sites, that's all just cosmetics.
Cosmetics, meaning you are basically treating the symptoms, not the actual disease. You're putting makeup on a corpse. He argues the root cause is the highly specific nature of the regime's religious ideology.
He has this really chilling phrase regarding the history of the region: become Muslim or die.
Yes, he traces the history all the way back to the original Arab conquests. He says Islam entered Persia originally through military conquest. The rule was become Muslim or die. But he argues the current regime has updated this doctrine to a stay Muslim or die basis. It is an intricate system of absolute compulsory obedience.
This is where we get into the psychology of the Ayatollah himself, and I think this is genuinely hard for a lot of Westerners to fully grasp. The source claims the Ayatollah doesn't see himself as a president or a standard head of state.
Not at all. The source argues the Ayatollah views himself as a global spiritual authority, answering directly to what the author calls a higher demonic force. Now, whether you accept that theology or not from a purely political analysis standpoint, this is vital to understand.
Because it changes how he makes decisions.
Exactly. It means he isn't sitting in a room making rational calculations about GDP growth or trade balances or election cycles. He is operating on a cosmic timeline.
And that explains the casualty figures, which usually baffle Western analysts. The source brings up the mass execution of 30,000 dissidents.
This is a horrifying but deeply important detail to understand the regime's internal logic. The source argues that to the regime, the actual number 30,000 is totally irrelevant.
Irrelevant how?
Because if only 3,000 people had disobeyed, only 3,000 would have been killed. If 1,000,000 had disobeyed, 1,000,000 would die. The crime in their eyes isn't being an enemy combatant. The crime is the disobedience itself.
Obey and you live. Disobey and face the absolute consequences. It's completely binary.
And this is exactly why the author believes traditional Western deterrence completely fails here. He says the Ayatollah is literally baffled when Westerners complain about civilian casualties. Yes, because in his specific worldview, death is just a necessary mechanism for enforcing divine will on earth. If you heavily value life and your adversary actually reveres death, you are speaking two entirely different languages. You cannot deter someone who actively welcomes the apocalypse.
So if the enemy doesn't care about dying and clearly doesn't care about killing, how on earth do you fight them? The source says you have to attack the source of that authority. You have to break the spell.
Which brings us to the most controversial and arguably the most unique part of this entire plan: spiritual clarity.
This is where the source takes a really hard left turn into pure theology. And honestly, reading this part for the first time, it felt a bit jarring. We go from discussing hypersonic missile specs and military doctrine to talking about demonic entities. How do we even parse this without sounding like we've wandered into some obscure conspiracy theory forum?
It is definitely jarring, But you really have to look at why the author includes it in a strategic document. He's attempting to diagnose the deep psychological root of the regime's resilience. He uses the term anti-religion to describe the specific ideology operating within the regime.
An anti-religion.
Yes.
Yeah.
He argues that the entity described in their particular interpretation of the Quran is not the omnipotent God, but a deceptive entity. He even goes as far as to question the historical existence of Muhammad entirely. He contrasts him with biblical prophets like Isaiah, who he says made verifiable historical prophecies.
Again, we are absolutely not endorsing this theological view. We are just reporting what's in the text. But why does he go there? Why bring this heavy theology into a modern geopolitical strategy document?
Because he fundamentally believes the regime's absolute power is a Berlin Wall, built entirely on this specific ideology. Look, the Berlin Wall didn't fall because NATO bombed it.
Right, no shots are fired.
It fell because the people living on the eastern side simply stopped believing in the authority and legitimacy of the Soviet system. They just walked away.
So he's arguing for a mass apostasy, a mass public rejection of the faith that underpins the entire regime.
Precisely. He calls it liberation. He says if the people achieve this spiritual clarity, if they collectively realize that the regime is serving a demonic force rather than a divine one, the fear evaporates. The obedience breaks. And without that blind obedience, the regime collapses without a single bullet being fired. It cuts the puppet strings.
And here's the really big, but in this plan, you cannot do that inside Iran today. If you stand up in a square in Tehran today and loudly say this religion is false, you don't get a polite debate. You get executed.
Exactly. You are silenced immediately and brutally. That is exactly why the strategy completely pivots away from the people inside and focuses on the diaspora.
The 10 million Iranians currently living outside of Iran.
The 10 million. These are people living in free societies. The U.S., Europe, Canada, Australia, they have absolute free speech. They have the legal right to assembly. They are physically safe. The Ayatollah cannot touch them. The source argues they are the key to the whole lock.
He says the Ayatollah isn't their jailer. He says the Ayatollah is imprisoned by his own ideology. But the diaspora is completely free. So the grand plan is for them to have this mass spiritual reckoning first.
Yes, this is essentially a contagion strategy. If the 10 million people outside reject the spiritual legitimacy of the regime loudly and clearly and consistently, that message inevitably seeps back inside. It breaks the intense psychological isolation of the people living inside Iran. It shows them that the emperor truly has no clothes and no God.
So step one is this massive spiritual rejection. But then the plan gets very practical. It gets intensely political. He talks about out-organizing Benjamin Netanyahu.
Which is a remarkably high bar to set.
Yeah.
The source actually has a lot of praise for Netanyahu's political effectiveness. He says Netanyahu single-handedly made Iran a top-tier U.S. priority. But he argues a unified diaspora, let's say just 10% of that 10 million, so a million people organized under one unified umbrella, could be even more powerful on the world stage.
Let's talk about the logistics of this government-in-waiting concept. Because historically speaking, the Iranian diaspora is pretty famous for, well, not getting along with each other.
It's heavily fractured, yes.
You've got the monarchists who want to install the Shah's son. You've got the MEK. You've got the secular liberal Democrats. They seem to fight each other almost as much as they fight the regime. How does this source think they can just magically unite overnight?
That is undeniably the weak link in the strategic chain, and the source definitely knows it. That's exactly why he proposes this umbrella structure. He is not asking them to merge their political parties permanently. He's asking for a temporary, highly strategic coalition focused entirely on a single outcome, the total removal of the regime. He creates a very careful distinction between a transition team and a future permanent government.
So it's about finding a common denominator that is so existentially big that everything else looks petty by comparison.
It's exactly right. It's a massive big tent strategy based on a shared existential realization. And practically speaking, he's talking about mobilizing 10% of the diaspora. That's his specific metric. He isn't asking for 100% participation. He knows you will never get everyone to agree. But 10% of 10 million is 1 million highly active, engaged participants. That is a formidable political bloc in any Western capital.
I mean, imagine 1 million people marching in D.C., London, Paris, and Berlin on the exact same day with the exact same message under the exact same banner. That completely takes over the news cycle.
It forces Western leaders to actually pay attention. And more importantly, it gives them a legitimate partner. Right now, when the U.S. State Department wants to talk to the Iranian people, who do they call? There is no phone number. This proposal creates a phone number.
And having that phone number allows for the massive diplomatic blitz we talked about earlier. This brings us right to the grand bargain. Just imagine this scenario for a second. You have a newly unified Iranian opposition government sitting in exile, maybe operating out of Paris or Washington, D.C., and they don't just hold protests. They start cutting high-level geopolitical deals.
This is the grand bargain. And honestly, this is the part that I think makes this entire plan geostrategically viable, at least in pure theory. The source suggests this government in waiting engages in a rapid diplomatic blitz with all the major superpowers.
Let's break down these hypothetical deals because they are fascinating. What do they offer China? And why would Beijing even take the meeting?
This is crucial. To understand this, we have to talk about something called the Malacca dilemma. China imports a massive percentage of its daily energy, its oil, from Iran and the broader Middle East. Right now, today, that critical supply is severely threatened by a potential regional war. If Israel decides to strike the main oil terminals at Karg Island, China's lights literally go out. China hates instability above all else.
So the mullahs are actually really bad for Chinese business right now.
They are incredibly high-risk partners. They are actively disrupting global shipping in the Red Sea via their proxies, the Houthis. They are risking a major uncontained war that could easily spike global oil prices to $200 a barrel. So the new government in waiting flies to Beijing and says, look, we pledge to seamlessly continue oil sales to you. You will not lose a drop of your supply. And unlike the mullahs, we will not blow up the international shipping lanes.
That is smart. You completely neutralize China's main objection to regime change by offering them guaranteed stability. What about Russia, then?
Russia is entirely transactional in this arena. They desperately want a captive market for their weapons exports and hard cash to fund their own ongoing wars. The new government goes to Moscow and says, we will absolutely honor all existing contracts. We will continue your arms purchases. Your revenue stream is completely safe with us.
So you're basically telling Putin, don't worry, you get your money either way.
Exactly. You are systematically removing the primary financial incentives for Russia and China to prop up the Ayatollah. You are making them effectively neutral. You aren't asking them to actively help you overthrow the government. You're just paying them off to stay out of the way when it happens.
And then the really big one, what do they offer Israel to get them on board?
They offer everything. They offer the immediate end of the entire nuclear program. They offer to curb all ballistic missile development. They offer to completely shut down the secret underground facilities. And most importantly, they offer to permanently sever all financial and military ties with the proxies. No more Hezbollah, no more Hamas, no more Houthis.
That is literally the dream scenario for Israel. It ends the eight-front war instantly.
Right. And because it is coming directly from a legitimate alternative government that is actually supported by the Iranian people themselves, it is infinitely more credible than some flimsy treaty signed by a duplicitous regime that breaks promises constantly.
Okay, so they've got China, Russia, and Israel. Finally, what do they ask of the United States? What is the specific ask for Donald Trump in this scenario?
The ask is surprisingly small. And that's the beauty of it. They don't ask for a $1 trillion invasion. They don't ask for 2 decades of nation building. They ask for one very specific thing: the absolute guarantee and protection of the right to peaceful protest inside Iran.
Protect our right to scream. That's the whole ask.
That is the crucial lever. The source argues that once the diaspora organizes externally and these grand bargain deals are cut internationally, the people inside Iran will feel the shift. They will start to rise up en masse. They will pour into the streets. And at that point, the regime's only remaining card to play is horrific violence, mass slaughter to quell the uprising.
And that is exactly where the U.S. military comes in.
Yes, that's the tactical endgame. The U.S. and Israel issue a very stark joint ultimatum to the regime. If you touch the protesters, if you unleash the military on the crowds, we will completely disable you.
Let's talk about these disabling strikes, because he's clear this isn't standard shock and awe invasion stuff. It's a very specific, high-tech intervention.
It is an incredibly tech-heavy surgical intervention. Phase 1 is jamming. Complete communications blackouts across the country.
Blind the commanders so they can't talk to the troops in the streets?
Precisely. Phase 2 is massive cyber operations.
Yeah.
But let's be really specific here. We aren't just talking about defacing a few government websites. We are talking about physically severing the deep fiber optic backbones that connect the military command centers to the missile silos. We are talking about freezing the central financial systems so the Revolutionary Guard literally cannot pay its soldiers their daily wages.
Paralyze the entire apparatus of the state.
Yes. And then phase 3. First, strikes on critical above-ground targets. But here is the absolute genius part of the argument regarding those Mach 3.3 missiles we discussed. The source completely anticipates that the regime will try to launch their hypersonic missiles in a desperate final act.
Right, the ones with the plasma cloaking that threaten the carriers.
Right. But the source argues that the very act of launching a missile is a revealing act. You can't hide the physics of a launch.
How so? Walk me through that.
Missiles generate massive amounts of heat, a completely unavoidable massive amount of infrared energy right at the moment of ignition. The split second they power up and launch, they create a colossal thermal bloom. And that bloom is instantly visible to advanced early warning satellites sitting in geostationary orbit. It reveals their exact physical location on the ground instantly. The U.S. and Israel, who are already waiting with superior surveillance arrays, use that real-time thermal data to target and destroy the launch sites before they can even attempt to reload a second volley. He calls it a missile trap.
So the regime tries to fire its ultimate weapon, and in doing so, entirely exposes itself to immediate destruction from above. The source says the regime could be fully neutralized in hours.
Hours. Not years of grueling, bloody occupation. Hours of high-intensity, extreme precision dismantlement.
And the end result of all this?
The regime completely collapses under its own hollow weight. It has zero spiritual authority left because the people have mass rejected it. It has zero international backup because China and Russia have been effectively bought off. And it has zero military capacity left to crush the internal dissent because the U.S. has jammed their comms and blown up their active launchers.
It falls exactly like the Berlin Wall.
That is the grand vision.
It is honestly breathless. It really is. It turns the entire standard geopolitical problem on its head. Instead of asking how do we successfully invade and conquer them, it asks how do we systematically make them completely irrelevant.
It brilliantly shifts the entire center of gravity from the hard military domain to the will of the people.
I want to zoom out for just a second because there's one more piece to this puzzle. We briefly mentioned the Iron Alliance early in the intro. There is a lot of material in our source stack about India. Why is India suddenly in this conversation? It seems like a totally odd addition to a Middle East strategic deep dive.
It does seem out of place at first, but this is a deeply fascinating contextual layer. We have these video reports in the stack about Prime Minister Modi's historic visit to Tel Aviv.
First Indian PM to ever officially visit Israel. That's a massive deal geopolitically.
Huge. And Netanyahu's reception was incredibly warm. He said, "You stood with us. I am deeply moved." They openly talked about cultural ties going back 2,000 years.
They focused on friendship, security, and innovation.
Right. And the source seems to heavily imply that this emerging new geopolitical bloc, Israel, India, and the U.S., is the actual Iron Alliance that creates the global pressure cooker, making this entire diaspora strategy possible. Think about it. You have the U.S. providing the raw, unmatchable military power. You have Israel providing the on-the-ground intelligence and the immediate geographic proximity. And you have India acting as this massive, rising global giant that provides crucial diplomatic legitimacy.
Wait, why does India specifically provide the legitimacy?
Because India represents the broader global south. Look, if the U.S. and the U.K. just decide to topple a Middle Eastern government, it automatically looks like classic Western imperialism to half the world. But if India is deeply involved and supportive, it looks like a genuine global consensus. India is the world's largest democracy. It has a massive, largely moderate Muslim population of its own. If India officially supports this new government in waiting, it heavily validates it in the eyes of the entire non-Western world.
And the source author, Baraxis, has actually written books about this broader shift, hasn't he? There was a mention of something called Kalkiism.
Yes, he has several titles mentioned, like The Great Subcontinent Uprising and Kalkiism. Now, Kalki is a very specific messianic figure in Hinduism. It's the final avatar of the god Vishnu, who supposedly arrives to end the current age of darkness and initiate a new cycle of time.
That is so interesting. So he is actively blending ancient Hindu eschatology with modern, high-tech Middle East politics.
It really suggests a sprawling worldview where the center of global geopolitical gravity is fundamentally shifting eastward. He clearly sees India not just as a handy trading partner, but as a major structural pillar of an entirely new global peace architecture. It's almost as if he sees this specific Iran strategy as just one necessary part of a much larger realignment of the global order, a place where Eastern spiritual clarity directly meets Western military tech.
Wow, so the stars are really aligning in this narrative. You have a highly frustrated Trump looking for a win. You have a desperate Israel fighting 8 wars. You have a rising India ready to flex its diplomatic muscle. And you have a massive diaspora that is just waiting for the right signal to unite.
And a regime sitting in Tehran that is potentially far more brittle and hollow than it projects to the outside world.
So what does this all mean for us, for you listening to this deep dive right now?
I think it deeply challenges the pervasive cynicism we usually feel when we look at the Middle East. We are culturally trained to think, oh, they've been fighting in the desert for thousands of years. It will literally never end. But this proposal boldly says no. Tyrannies are inherently fragile constructs. They rely entirely on belief to sustain themselves. If you break the underlying belief, you permanently break the tyranny.
It also incredibly empowers the individual. If you are listening to this right now and you happen to be part of the Iranian diaspora, this source text is talking directly to you. It's explicitly saying you are the actual superpower in this equation, not the multi-billion-dollar aircraft carrier sitting in the Gulf.
Yeah.
You.
It entirely frames the conflict not as a kinetic clash of standing armies, but as a fundamental clash of will.
Let's do a really quick recap of the Brackface plan before we wrap this up, just to make sure we lock it all in, because we covered a lot of ground today.
For sure. It's worth reviewing. Step 1. Explicitly recognize the regime's nature as evil and existentially threatening. You have to move past the traditional territorial dispute mindset. Step 2. The diaspora officially achieves spiritual clarity and publicly rejects the regime's religious hold, forming a massive psychological break. Step 3. They organize a legitimate government in waiting under one unified umbrella.
The coalition.
Yes. Step 4, they cut the grand bargain. Keep China and Russia totally neutral with massive oil and arms deals. Give Israel peace.
And the U.S. role.
Step 5, get the U.S. to absolutely guarantee the safety of peaceful protests inside Iran via the credible threat of overwhelming force. Step 6, the internal civilian uprising begins. The regime inevitably tries to crack down with violence.
Which triggers Step 7.
Exactly.
Yes.
Step 7. Disabling strikes completely neutralize the regime's military using cyber attacks, jamming, and the kinetic missile traps we discussed, which leads to Step 8, total regime collapse.
Simple, audacious, and maybe actually possible.
It is certainly a better blueprint than blundering into World War III.
So true. Here's my final thought for you to chew on, listeners. We so often think of raw power as pure hardware, right? Missiles, tanks, concrete barrier carriers. But this deep dive really suggests that the ultimate prison is the human mind. The Ayatollah is totally imprisoned by his own ideology. The people inside are imprisoned by sheer terror and fear. If that mental prison is unlocked, if the spiritual legitimacy just evaporates into thin air, does the physical military power even matter anymore? Can a regime physically stand if literally no one believes in it anymore?
And can a population living thousands of miles away in a completely different country actually change the destiny of their homeland without ever setting foot on its soil? I really think that is the defining question of the 21st century.
It is absolutely a question worth asking. Thanks for diving deep with us today.
Always a pleasure.
We will see you in the next deep dive.